short history of Gothic. Markheim by Robert Louis Stevenson.
Yes, said the dealer. Our windfalls are of various kinds. Some customers are ignorant, and then I touch a dividend on my superior knowledge. Some are dishonest. And here he held up the candle so that the light fell strongly on his visitor. And in that case, he continued, I profit by my virtue. At these pointed words, and before the near presence of the flame, Markheim blinked painfully and looked aside. The dealer chuckled. You come to me on Christmas Day, he resumed, when you know that I am alone in my house and make a point of refusing business. I am the essence of discretion and ask no awkward questions, but when a customer cannot look me in the eye, he has to pay for it. He once more chuckled. And then, changing to his usual business voice, though still with a note of irony, you can give, as usual, a clear account of how you came into the possession of the object. This time, said Markheim, you are in error. I have not come to sell, but to buy. I have no more curios to dispose of. I have done well on the stock exchange, and should more likely add to it than otherwise, and my errand today is simplicity itself. I seek a Christmas present for a lady. He continued, waxing more fluent as he struck into the speech he had prepared. And certainly I owe you every excuse for thus disturbing you upon so small a matter, but the thing was neglected yesterday. I must produce my little compliment at dinner, and as you very well know, a rich marriage is not a thing to be neglected. There followed a pause, during which the dealer seemed to weigh this statement incredulously. The ticking of many clocks among the curious lumber of the shop filled up the interval of silence. Well, sir, said the dealer, be it so. You are an old customer after all, and if, as you say, you have the chance of a good marriage, far be it from me to be an obstacle. Here is a nice thing for a lady now, he went on. This hand glass, 15th century, comes from a good collection too. The dealer stooped to take the object from its place, and as he did so, a shock passed through Markheim, a sudden leap of many tumultuous passions to the face. It passed as swiftly as it came, and left no trace beyond a certain trembling of the hand that now received the glass. A glass, he said hoarsely, a glass? For Christmas? Surely not. And why not? Cried the dealer. Why not a glass? Markheim was looking upon him with an indefinable expression. You ask me, why not? Why, look here. Look in it. Look at yourself. Do you like to see it? No. Nor any man. The little man had jumped back when Markheim had so suddenly confronted him with the mirror, but now, perceiving there was nothing worse on hand, he chuckled. Your future lady, sir, must be pretty hard-favoured. I ask you, said Markheim, for a Christmas present, and you give me this damned reminder of years and sins and follies, this hand conscience. Did you mean it? Had you a thought in your mind? Tell me. It will be better for you if you do. Come, tell me about yourself. I hazard a guess now that you are in secret a very charitable man. The dealer looked closely at his companion. It was very odd. Markheim did not appear to be laughing. There was something in his face like an eager sparkle of hope, but nothing of mirth. What are you driving at? The dealer asked. Not charitable, returned the other gloomily. Not charitable, not pious, not scrupulous, unloving, unbeloved. A hand to get money, a safe to keep it. Is that all, dear God, man, is that all? I will tell you what it is, began the dealer with some sharpness, and then broke off again into a chuckle. But I see this is a love match of yours, and you have been drinking the lady's health. Ah, cried Markheim with a strange curiosity. Ah, have you been in love? Tell me about that. I, cried the dealer. "I in love? I never had the time, nor have I the time today for all this nonsense. Either make your purchase or walk out of my shop." "True, said Markheim. "Enough fooling. To business. Show me something else." The dealer stooped once more, his thin blonde hair falling over his eyes as he did so. Markheim moved a little nearer, with one hand in the pocket of his greatcoat. "This, perhaps, may suit," observed the dealer, and then, as he began to re-arise, Markheim bounded from behind upon his victim. The long, skewer-like dagger flashed and fell. The dealer struggled like a hen and then tumbled on the floor in a heap. Markheim looked about him awfully. The candle stood on the counter, its flame solemnly wagging in a draught, and by that inconsiderable movement the whole room was filled with noiseless bustle and kept heaving like a sea. From these fear-stricken rovings, Markheim's eyes returned to the body of his victim, where it lay both humped and sprawling, incredibly small and strangely meaner than in life. Markheim had feared to see it, and lo! It was nothing. There it must lie. There was none to work the cunning hinges or direct the miracle of locomotion. There it must lie till it was found. Found. Aye. And then? Then would this dead flesh lift up a cry that would ring over England and fill the world with the echoes of pursuit. Aye, dead or not, this was still the enemy. Time, which had closed for the victim, had become instant and momentous for the slayer. The thought was yet in his mind when, first one and then another, with every variety of pace and voice, the clocks began to strike the hour of 3 in the afternoon. The sudden outbreak of so many tongues in that dumb chamber staggered him. He began to bestir himself, going to and fro with the candle, and still, as he filled his pockets, his mind accused him of 1,000 faults of his design. He should have chosen a more quiet hour. He should have prepared an alibi. He should have been more cautious and only bound and gagged the dealer and not killed him. He should have been more bold and killed the servant also. He should have done all things otherwise. Poignant regrets, weary, incessant toiling of the mind to change what was unchangeable. But he was now so pulled about by different alarms that, while one portion of his mind was still alert and cunning, another trembled on the brink of lunacy. One hallucination in particular took a strong hold on his credulity. Here, within the house, was he alone? He knew he was. He had watched the servant set forth, sweethearting in her poor best, out for the day, written in every ribbon and smile. Yes, he was alone, of course. And yet, in the bulk of empty house above him, he could surely hear a stir of delicate footing. He was surely conscious, inexplicably conscious, of some presence. Here was a hint to hurry what remained to be done. To have done the deed and yet not to reap the profit would be too abhorrent a failure. The money. That was now Markheim's concern, and as a means to that, the keys. With a tremor of the belly, he drew near the body of his victim. Although so dingy and inconsiderable to the eye, he feared it might have more significance to the touch. He took the body by the shoulders and turned it on its back. It was strangely light and supple, and the limbs fell into the oddest postures. The face was robbed of all expression, but it was as pale as wax and shockingly smeared with blood about one temple. That was, for Markheim, the one displeasing circumstance. It carried him back upon the instant to a certain fair day in a fisher's village, a grey day, a crowd upon the street, the blare of the brasses, the booming of drums, and a boy, going to and fro, buried overhead in the crowd and divided between interest and fear, until, coming out upon the chief place of concourse, he beheld a booth and a great screen with pictures garishly coloured. Brownrigg with her apprentice, the Mannings with their murdered guest, Weir in the death grip of Thurtle, and a score besides of famous crimes. The thing was as clear as an illusion. He was once again that little boy. He was looking once again, and with the same sense of physical revolt, at these vile pictures. He judged it more prudent to confront than to flee from these considerations, looking the more hardily in the dead face, bending his mind to realize the nature and greatness of his crime. So little a while ago that face had moved with every change of sentiment, that body had been all on fire with governable energies, and now, and by his act, that piece of life had been arrested, as the horologist with interjected finger arrests the beating of the clock. So he reasoned in vain. He could rise to no more remorseful consciousness. The same heart which had shuddered before the painted effigies of crime looked on its reality unmoved. With that, shaking himself clear of these considerations, Markheim found the keys and advanced towards the open inner door of the shop. As he approached, he seemed to hear, in answer to his own cautious tread, the steps of another foot withdrawing up the stair. The sense that he was not alone grew upon him to the verge of madness. On every side he was haunted and begirt by presences. He heard them moving in the upper chambers, and as he began with a great effort to mount the stairs, feet fled quietly before him and followed stealthily behind. The 24 steps to the first floor were 24 agonies. On that first story the doors stood ajar, 3 of them, like 3 ambushes, shaking his nerves like the throats of cannon. He longed to be home, girt in by walls, buried among bedclothes, and invisible to all but God. And at that thought he wondered a little, recollecting tales of other murderers and the fear they were said to entertain of heavenly avengers. It was not so, at least, with him. He feared the laws of nature, lest in their callous and immutable procedure they should preserve some damning evidence of his crime. He feared tenfold more, with a slavish, superstitious terror, some scission in the continuity of man's experience, some wilful illegality of nature. The solid walls might become transparent and reveal his doings like those of bees in a glass hive. The stout planks might yield under his foot like quicksands and detain him in their clutch. These things he feared. And, in a sense, these things might be called the hands of God reached forth against sin. But about God himself he was at ease. His act was doubtless exceptional, but so were his excuses, which God knew. It was there, and not among men, that he felt sure of justice. When he had got safe into the drawing-room and shut the door behind him, he was aware of a respite from alarms. The room was quite dismantled and strewn with packing cases and incongruous furniture, many pictures standing with their faces to the wall, a cabinet of marquetry, and a great old bed with tapestry hangings. Here, then, Markheim drew in a packing case before the cabinet, and began to search among the keys. It was a long business, for there were many, and it was irksome besides, for, after all, there might be nothing in the cabinet, and time was on the wing. But the closeness of the occupation sobered him. In truth, he was at peace. The rain falling in the street sounded natural and pleasant. Presently, on the other side, the notes of a piano were wakened to the music of a hymn, and the voices of many children took up the air and words. Markheim gave ear to it smilingly as he sorted out the keys, and his mind was thronged with answerable ideas and images, church-going children and the pealing of the high organ, and the high, genteel voice of the parson, which he smiled a little to recall, and the painted Jacobean tombs and the dim lettering of the 10 Commandments in the chancel. And as he sat thus, at once busy and absent, he was startled to his feet. A flash of ice, a flash of fire, a bursting gush of blood went over him, and then he stood transfixed and thrilling. A step mounted the stair slowly and steadily, and presently a hand was laid upon the knob, and the lock clicked, and the door opened. Fear held Markheim in a vice. What to expect he knew not. Whether the dead man walking, or the official ministers of human justice, or some chance witness blindly stumbling in to consign him to the gallows. But when a face was thrust into the aperture, glanced round the room, looked at him, nodded and smiled as if in friendly recognition, and then withdrew again. His fear broke loose from his control in a hoarse cry. At the sound of this, the visitant returned. "Did you call me?" he asked pleasantly, and with that he entered the room and closed the door behind him. Markheim stood and gazed at him with all his eyes. Perhaps there was a film upon his sight, but the outlines of the newcomer seemed to change and waver, and at times he thought he knew him, and at times he thought he bore a likeness to himself, and always, like a lump of living terror, there lay in his bosom the conviction that this thing was not of the earth, and not of God. And yet the creature had a strange air of the commonplace, and when he added, "You are looking for the money, I believe, Mr. Markheim," it was in the tones of everyday politeness. Markheim made no answer. "I should warn you," resumed the other, "that the maid has left her sweetheart earlier than usual, and will soon be here." "You know me?" cried the murderer. The visitor smiled. "You have long been a favourite of mine," he said, "and I have long observed and often sought to help you." "What are you?" cried Markheim. "The devil?" "What I may be," returned the other, "cannot affect the service I propose to render you." "It can," cried Markheim. "It does. Be helped by you. No, never, not by you. You do not know me yet. Thank God you do not know me." "I know you," replied the visitant, with a sort of kind severity. "I know you to the soul." "Know me?" cried Markheim. "Who can do so? I have lived to belie my nature. All men do. All men are better than this disguise that grows about and stifles them. You see each dragged away by life, like one whom bravos have seized and muffled in a cloak. If they had their own control, if you could see their faces, they would be altogether different. They would shine out for heroes and saints. I am worse than most. Myself is more overlaid. My excuse is known to men and God. But had I the time, I could disclose myself." "To me?" inquired the visitant. "To you before all," returned the murderer. "I supposed you were intelligent. I thought, since you exist, you could prove a reader of the heart, and yet you would propose to judge me by my acts. I was born, and I have lived in a land of giants. Giants have dragged me by the wrists since I was born out of my mother, the giants of circumstance. And you would judge me by my acts? But can you not look within? Can you not understand that evil is hateful to me? Can you not read me for a thing that surely must be common as humanity, the unwilling sinner?" "All this is very feelingly expressed," was the reply, "but it regards me not. I care not in the least by what compulsion you may have been dragged away, so as you are but carried in the right direction. But time flies. The servant, she keeps moving nearer. And remember, it is as if the gallows itself was striding towards you through the streets. Shall I help you? I, who know all, shall I tell you where to find the money?" "For what price?" asked Markheim. "I offer you the service for a Christmas gift," returned the other. Markheim could not refrain from smiling with a kind of bitter triumph. "No," said he, "I will take nothing at your hands. If I were dying of thirst, and it was your hand that put the pitcher to my lips, I should find the courage to refuse." "I have no objection to a deathbed repentance," observed the visitant. "Because you disbelieve their efficacy," Markheim cried. "I do not say so," returned the other. "But I look on these things from a different side, and when the life is done, my interest falls. The man has lived to serve me, to spread black looks under colour of religion, or to sow tares in the wheatfield as you do in a course of weak compliance with desire. Now that he draws so near to his deliverance, he can add but one act of service, to repent, to die smiling, and thus to build up in confidence and hope the more timorous of my surviving followers. I am not so hard a master. Try me, accept my help. Please yourself in life as you have done hitherto. Please yourself more amply. And when the night begins to fall and the curtains to be drawn, I tell you, for your greater comfort, that you will find it even easy to compound your quarrel with your conscience, and to make a truckling peace with God. Do you think I have no more generous aspirations than to sin, and at the last sneak into heaven? Asked Markheim. My heart rises at the thought. Is this, then, your experience of mankind? Or is it because you find me with red hands that you presume such baseness? Murder is to me no special category, replied the other. All sins are murder, even as all life is war. I behold your race like starving mariners on a raft, plucking crusts out of the hands of famine and feeding on each other's lives. I follow sins beyond the moment of their acting. I find in all that the last consequence is death. And to my eyes, the pretty maid who thwarts her mother with such taking graces on a question of a ball drips no less visibly with human gore than such a murderer as yourself. Evil, for which I live, consists not in action but in character. The bad man is dear to me, not the bad act. And it is not because you have killed a dealer, but because you are Markheim, that I offer to forward your escape. I will lay my heart open to you, answered Markheim. This crime, on which you find me, is my last. On my way to it I have learned many lessons. Itself is a lesson, a momentous lesson. Hitherto I have been driven with revolt to what I would not. I was a bondslave to poverty, driven and scourged. There are robust virtues that can stand in these temptations. Mine are not so. I had a thirst of pleasure. But today, and out of this deed, I pluck both warning and riches, both the power and a fresh resolve to be myself. I become in all things a free actor in the world. Something comes over me out of the past, something of what I have dreamed on Sabbath evenings to the sound of the church organ, of what I forecast when I shed tears over noble books or talked, an innocent child, with my mother. There lies my life. I have wandered a few years, but now I see once more my city of destination. You are to use this money on the stock exchange, I think, remarked the visitor, and there, if I mistake not, you have already lost some thousands. Ah, said Markheim, but this time I have a sure thing. This time, again, you will lose, replied the visitor quietly. Ah, but I keep back the half, cried Markheim. That also you will lose, said the other. The sweat started upon Markheim's brow. Well then, what matter? He exclaimed. Say it be lost. Say I am plunged again in poverty. Shall one part of me, and that the worst, continue until the end to override the better? Evil and good run strong in me, hailing me both ways. Are my vices only to direct my life, and my virtues without effect, like some passive lumber of the mind? Not so. Good also is a spring of acts. But the visitant raised his finger. For 36 years that you have been in this world, said he, through many changes of fortune and varieties of humour, I have watched you steadily fall. 15 years ago you would have started at a theft. 3 years back you would have blenched at the name of murder. Is there any crime? Is there any cruelty or meanness from which you still recoil? Downward, downward lies your way, nor can anything but death avail to stop you. It is true, Markheim said huskily. I have in some degree complied with evil. Then, said the visitor, content yourself with what you are, for you will never change, and the words of your part on this stage are irrevocably written down. Markheim stood for a long while silent, and indeed it was the visitor who first broke the silence. That being so, he said, shall I show you the money? And grace? Cried Markheim. Have you not tried it? returned the other. 2 or 3 years ago, did I not see you on the platform of revival meetings, and was not your voice the loudest in the hymn? It is true, said Markheim, and I see clearly what remains for me by way of duty. I thank you for these lessons from my soul. My eyes are opened, and I behold myself at last for what I am. At this moment, the sharp note of the doorbell rang through the house, and the visitant, as though this were some concerted signal for which he had been waiting, changed at once in his demeanour. "The maid!" he cried. "She has returned, as I forewarned you, and there is now before you one more difficult passage. Her master, you must say, is ill. You must let her in with an assured but rather serious countenance, no smiles, no overacting, and I promise you success. Once the girl within and the door closed, the same dexterity that has already rid you of the dealer will relieve you of this last danger in your path. Thenceforward you have the whole evening, the whole night, if needful, to ransack the treasures of the house and to make good your safety. Up!" he cried. "Up, friend! Your life hangs trembling in the scales. Up and act!" Markheim steadily regarded his counsellor. "If I be condemned to evil acts," he said, "there is still one door of freedom open. I can cease from action. If my life be an ill thing, I can lay it down. My love of good is damned to barrenness, but I have still my hatred of evil, and from that, to your galling disappointment, you shall see that I can draw both energy and courage." The features of the visitor began to undergo a wonderful and lovely change. They brightened and softened with a tender triumph, and even as they brightened, faded and dislimned. But Markheim did not pause to watch or understand the transformation. He opened the door and went downstairs very slowly, thinking to himself. Life, as he thus reviewed it, tempted him no longer, but on the farther side he perceived a quiet haven for his bark. He paused in the passage and looked into the shop, where the candle still burned by the dead body. It was strangely silent. Thoughts of the dealer swarmed into his mind as he stood gazing, and then the bell once more broke out into impatient clamour. He confronted the maid upon the threshold with something like a smile. "You had better go for the police," said he. "I have killed your master."
Hugh Bonneville was reading Markheim by Robert Louis Stevenson. The story was abridged and produced by Gemma Jenkins. A short history of Gothic. Clytie by Eudora Welty.
It was late afternoon, with heavy silver clouds which looked bigger and wider than cotton fields, and presently it began to rain. Big round drops fell, still in the sunlight, on the hot tin sheds, and stained the white false fronts of the row of stores in the little town of Farr's Gin. A hen and her string of yellow chickens ran in great alarm across the road. The dust turned river brown, and the birds flew down into it immediately, sitting out little pockets in which to take baths. The few people standing with long shadows on the level road moved over into the post office. After everyone else had gone under cover, Miss Clytie Farr stood still in the road, peering ahead in her near-sighted way, and as wet as the little birds. She usually came out of the big old house about this time in the afternoon and hurried through the town. It used to be that she ran about on some pretext or other, But now Clytie came for nothing. She came every day, and no one spoke to her any more. She would be in such a hurry and couldn't see who it was. And every Saturday they expected her to be run over, the way she darted out into the road with all the horses and trucks. It might be simply that Miss Clytie's wits were all leaving her, said the lady standing in the door to feel the cool, the way her sisters had left her, and she would just wait there to be told to go home. She would have to wring out everything she had on, the waist and the jumper skirt and the long black stockings. On her head was one of the straw hats from the furnishing store, with an old black satin ribbon pinned to it to make it a better hat and tied under the chin. Now, under the force of the rain, while the ladies watched, the hat slowly began to sag down on each side until it looked even more absurd and done for, like an old bonnet on a horse. In a little while there was a clap of thunder. "Miss Clytie, go in out of the rain, Miss Clytie," someone called. The old maid did not look around, but clenched her hands and drew them up under her armpits, and sticking out her elbows like hen wings, she ran out of the street, her poor hat creaking and beating about her ears. "Well, there goes Miss Clytie," the ladies said, and one of them had a premonition about her. Through the rushing water in the sunken path under the 4 wet black cedars, which smelled bitter as smoke, she ran to the house. "Where the devil have you been?" called the older sister Octavia from an upper window. Clytie looked up in time to see the curtain fall back. She went inside into the hall and waited, shivering. It was very dark and bare. The only light was falling on the white sheet which covered the solitary piece of furniture, an organ. The red curtains over the parlor door, held back by ivory hands, were still as tree trunks in the airless house. Every window was closed, and every shade was down, though behind them the rain could still be heard. Clytie took a match and advanced to the stair post, where the bronze cast of Hermes was holding up a gas fixture, and at once above this, lighted up but quite still, like one of the unmovable relics of the house, Octavia stood waiting on the stairs. She stood solidly before the white and lemon-colored glass of the window on the landing, and her wrinkled, unresting fingers took hold of the diamond cornucopia she always wore in the bosom of her long black dress. It was an unwithered grand gesture of hers, fondling the cornucopia. "It is not enough that we are waiting here, hungry," Octavia was saying, while Clytie waited below, "but you must sneak away and not answer when I call you. Go off and wander about the streets. Common. "Never mind, sister," Clytie managed to say. "But you always return." "Of course." "Gerald is awake now, and so is your papa," said Octavia, in the same vindictive voice, a loud voice, for she was usually calling. Clytie went to the kitchen and lighted the kindling in the wood stove. As if she were freezing cold in June, she stood before its open door, and soon a look of interest and pleasure lighted her face, which had in the last years grown weather-beaten in spite of the straw hat. Now some dream was resumed. In the street she had been thinking about the face of a child she had just seen. The child, playing with another of the same age, chasing it with a toy pistol, had looked at her with such an open, serene, trusting expression as she passed by. With this small, peaceful face still in her mind, rosy like these flames, Clytie had forgotten herself, and had been obliged to stand where she was in the middle of the road. But the rain had come down, and someone had shouted at her, and she had not been able to reach the end of her meditations. It had been a long time now since Clytie had first begun to watch faces, and to think about them. Anyone could have told you that there were not more than 150 people in Far's Gin, counting Negroes. yet the number of faces seemed to Clytie almost infinite. She knew now to look slowly and carefully at a face. She was convinced that it was impossible to see it all at once. The first thing she discovered about a face was always that she had never seen it before. When she began to look at people's actual countenances, there was no more familiarity in the world for her. The most profound, the most moving sight in the whole world must be a face. The mysterious smile of the old man who sold peanuts by the church gate returned to her. His face seemed for a moment to rest upon the iron door of the stove, set into the lion's mane. Other people said Mr. Tom Bates's boy, as he called himself, stared away with a face as clean blank as a watermelon seed. But to Clytie, who observed grains of sand in his eyes and in his old yellow lashes, he might have come out of a desert, like an Egyptian. But while she was thinking of Mr. Tom Bates's boy, there was a terrible gust of wind which struck her back, and she turned around. Shade billowed and plunged. The kitchen window was wide open. She had done it herself. She closed it gently. Octavia, who never came all the way downstairs for any reason, would never have forgiven her for an open window if she knew. Rain and sun signified ruin in Octavia's mind. Going over the whole house, Clytie made sure that everything was safe. It was not that ruin in itself could distress Octavia. Ruin or encroachment, even upon priceless treasures, and even in poverty, held no terror for her. It was simply some form of prying from without, and this she would not forgive. All of that was to be seen in her face. Clytie cooked the 3 meals on the stove, for they all ate different things, and set the 3 trays. She had to carry them in proper order up the stairs. She frowned in concentration, for it was hard to keep all the dishes straight, to make them come out right in the end, as old Lethe could have done. They had had to give up the cook long ago, when their father suffered the first stroke. Their father had been fond of old Lethe. She had been his nurse in childhood, and she had come back out of the country to see him when she heard he was dying. Old Lethe had come and knocked at the back door, and as usual, at the first disturbance, front or back, Octavia had peered down from behind the curtain and cried, "Go away! Go away! What the devil have you come here for?" And although old Lethe and their father had both pleaded that they might be allowed to see each other, Octavia had shouted as she always did, and sent the intruder away. Clytie had stood as usual, speechless in the kitchen, until finally she had repeated after her sister, "Lethe, go away." But their father had not died. He was instead paralyzed, blind, and able only to call out in unintelligible sounds and to swallow liquids. Lethe still would come to the back door now and then, but they never let her in, and the old man no longer heard or knew enough to beg to see her. There was only one caller admitted to his room. Once a week the barber came by appointment to shave him. Clytie went up to her father's room first, and set the tray down on a little marble table they kept by his bed. "I want to feed Papa," said Octavia, taking the bowl from her hands. "You fed him last time," said Clytie. Relinquishing the bowl, she looked down at the pointed face on the pillow. Tomorrow was the barber's day, and the sharp black points at their longest stuck out like needles all over the wasted cheeks. It was impossible to know what he felt. He looked as though he were really far away, neglected, free. Octavia began to feed him. Without taking her eyes from her father's face, Clytie suddenly began to speak in rapid, bitter words to her sister, the wildest words that came to her head. But soon she began to cry and gasp, like a small child who had been pushed by the big boys into the water. "That is enough," said Octavia. But Clytie could not take her eyes from her father's unshaven face and his still open mouth. "And I'll feed him tomorrow if I want to," said Octavia. She stood up. The thick hair, growing back after an illness and dyed almost purple, fell over her forehead. "Have you forgotten, Gerald?" she said. "And I am hungry too." Clytie went back to the kitchen and brought her sister's supper. Then she brought her brother's. Gerald's room was dark, and she had to push through the usual barricade. The smell of whiskey was everywhere. "It's night," said Clytie presently. Gerald lay on his bed looking at her. In the bad light he resembled his father. He stared at her in an exhausted, serious way. She stooped and held him up. He drank the coffee while she bent over him with her eyes closed, resting. Presently he pushed her away and fell back on the bed and began to describe how nice it was when he had a little house of his own down the street, all new, with all conveniences, gas stove, electric lights, when he was married to Rosemary. Rosemary! She had given up a job in the next town just to marry him. How had it happened that she had left him so soon? It meant nothing that he had threatened time and again to shoot her. She had not understood. He had only wanted to play with her. In a way, he had wanted to show her that he loved her above life and death. "Go to hell," Gerald said. His head was under the pillow. She took up the tray and left Gerald with his face hidden. It was not necessary for her to look at any of their faces. It was their faces which came between. Hurrying, she went down to the kitchen and began to eat her own supper. Their faces came between her face and another. It was their faces which had come pushing in between long ago to hide some face that had looked back at her. And now it was hard to remember the way it looked, or the time when she had first seen it. It must have been when she was young. Yes, in a sort of arbor. Hadn't she laughed, leaned forward? And that vision of a face, which was a little like all the other faces, the trusting child's, the innocent old travelers, even the greedy barbers and Lethies and the wandering peddlers who one by one knocked and went unanswered at the door, and yet different, yet far more. This face had been very close to hers, almost familiar, almost accessible. And then the face of Octavia was thrust between, and at other times the apoplectic face of her father, the face of her brother Gerald, and the face of her brother Henry with the bullet hole through the forehead. It was purely for a resemblance to a vision that she examined the secret, mysterious, unrepeated faces she met in the street of Far's Gin. But there was always an interruption. If anyone spoke to her, she fled. She was becoming more frightened all the time, too. People could tell because she never dressed up anymore. For years, every once in a while, she would come out in what was called an outfit, all in hunter's green, a hat that came down over her face like a bucket, a green silk dress, even green shoes with pointed toes. She would wear the outfit all one day if it was a pretty day, and then next morning she would be back in the faded jumper with her old hat tied under the chin, as if the outfit had been a dream. It had been a long time now since Clytie had dressed up so that you could see her coming. Once in a while, when a neighbor, trying to be kind or only being curious, would ask her opinion about anything, such as a pattern of crochet, she would not run away, but giving a thin, trapped smile, she would say in a childish voice, "It's nice." But, the ladies always added, nothing that came anywhere close to the Farr's house was nice for long. "It's nice," said Clytie, when the old lady next door showed her the new rosebush she had planted, all in bloom. But before an hour was gone, she came running out of the house screaming, "My sister Octavia says you take that rosebush up. My sister Octavia says you take that rosebush up and move it away from our fence. If you don't, I'll kill you. You take it away." And she would run back to the vegetable patch and begin to curse. The cursing was new, and she cursed softly, like a singer going over a song for the first time. But it was something she could not stop. Words which at first horrified Clytie poured in a full, light stream from her throat, which soon, nevertheless, felt strangely relaxed and rested. She cursed all alone in the peace of the vegetable garden. Sometimes, in the middle of her words, Clytie glanced up to where Octavia, at her window, looked down at her. When she let the curtain drop at last, Clytie would be left there, speechless. Finally, in a gentleness compounded of fright and exhaustion and love, an overwhelming love, she would wander through the gate and out through the town, gradually beginning to move faster until her long legs gathered a ridiculous rushing speed. She always ate rapidly, too, all alone in the kitchen, as she was eating now. She bit the meat savagely from the heavy silver fork and gnawed the little chicken bone until it was naked and clean. The next morning, Clytie bit into smiling lips as she cooked breakfast. Far out, past the secretly opened window, a freight train was crossing the bridge in the sunlight. Gerald had appeared dressed and wearing his spectacles and announced that he was going to the store today. The old Farr furnishing store did little business now, and people hardly missed Gerald when he did not come. A little high school girl could wait on anybody who came in. Now Gerald entered the dining room. "How are you this morning, Clytie?" he asked. "Just fine, Gerald. How are you?" "I'm going to the store." He sat down stiffly, and she laid a place on the table before him. From above, Octavia screamed, "Where the devil is my thimble? You stole my thimble, Clytie Farr. You carried it away, my little silver thimble." "It started," said Gerald intensely. "How can a man live in a house with women? How can he?" He jumped up and tore his napkin exactly in two. He walked out of the dining room without eating the first bite of his breakfast. She heard him going back upstairs into his room. "My thimble!" screamed Octavia. She waited one moment. Crouching eagerly, rather like a little squirrel, Clytie ate part of her breakfast over the stove before going up the stairs. At 9, Mr. Bobo, the barber, knocked at the front door. Without waiting, for they never answered the knock, he let himself in and advanced like a small general down the hall. He went ahead, under the arm of the tiptoed male statue, and up the dark stairway. There they were, lined up at the head of the stairs, and they all looked at him with repulsion. Mr. Bobo was convinced that they were every one mad. Gerald even had already been drinking at 9 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Bobo was short and had never been anything but proud of it, until he had started coming to this house once a week. But he did not enjoy looking up from below at the soft, long throats, the cold, repelled, high-reliefed faces of those Farrs. He could only imagine what one of those sisters would do to him if he made one move. As if he would. As soon as he arrived upstairs, they all went off and left him. Mr. Bobo stood and waited to be summoned, and wished he had never started coming to this house to shave old Mr. Farr. But he had been so surprised to get a letter in the mail. The letter was on such old yellowed paper that at first he thought it must have been written 1,000 years ago and never delivered. It was signed Octavia Farr, and began without even calling him dear Mr. Bobo. What it said was, "Come to this residence at 9 o'clock each Friday morning until further notice, where you will shave Mr. James Farr." He thought he would go one time, and each time after that he thought he would never go back, especially when he never knew when they would pay him anything. Of course, it was something to be the only person in Farr's gin allowed inside the house, except for the undertaker, who had gone there when young Henry shot himself, but had never to that day spoken of it. "I'll never go back," Mr. Bobo always ended to his customers. "Not even if they paid me. I've seen enough." Yet here he was again, waiting before the sick-room door. "This is the last time," he said. "By God!" And he wondered why the old man did not die. Just then Miss Clytie came out of the room. There she came in her funny sideways walk, and the closer she got to him, the more slowly she moved. "Now?" asked Mr. Bobo nervously. Clytie looked at his small, doubtful face. What fear ran through his little green eyes! His pitiful, greedy, small face, how very mournful it was, like a stray kitten's. What was it that this greedy little thing was so desperately needing? Clytie came up to the barber and stopped. Instead of telling him that he might go in and shave her father, she put out her hand and with breathtaking gentleness touched the side of his face. For an instant afterward, she stood looking at him inquiringly, and he stood like a statue, like the statue of Hermes. Then both of them uttered a despairing cry. Mr. Bobo turned and fled, waving his razor round in a circle, and Clytie, pale as a ghost, stumbled against the railing. The terrible scent of bay rum, of hair tonic, the horrible moist scratch of an invisible beard, the dense, popping green eyes. What had she got hold of with her hand? She could hardly bear it. The thought of that face. From the closed door of the sick-room came Octavia's shouting voice. "Clytie! Clytie! You haven't brought Papa the rainwater! Where in the devil is the rainwater to shave Papa?" Clytie moved obediently down the stairs. Her brother Gerald threw open the door of his room and called after her. "What now? This is a madhouse. Someone was running past my room. I heard it. Where do you keep your men? Do you have to bring them home?" He slammed the door again, and she heard the barricade going up. Clytie went through the lower hall and out the back door. She stood beside the old rain barrel and suddenly felt that this object now was her friend, just in time, and her arms almost circled it with impatient gratitude. The rain barrel was full. It bore a dark, heavy, penetrating fragrance, like ice and flowers and the dew of night. Clytie swayed a little and looked into the slightly moving water. She thought she saw a face there. Of course! It was the face she had been looking for, and from which she had been separated. As if to give a sign, the index finger of a hand lifted to touch the dark cheek. Clytie leaned closer, as she had leaned down to touch the face of the barber. It was a wavering, inscrutable face. The brows were drawn together as if in pain. The eyes were large, intent, almost avid. The nose ugly and discolored as if from weeping. The mouth old and closed from any speech. On either side of the head, dark hair hung down in a disreputable and wild fashion. Everything about the face frightened and shocked her with its signs of waiting, of suffering. For the second time that morning, Clytie recoiled, and as she did so, the other recoiled in the same way. Too late, she recognized the face. She stood there completely sick at heart, as though the poor, half-remembered vision had finally betrayed her. "Clytie! Clytie! The water! The water!" came Octavia's monumental voice. Clytie did the only thing she could think of to do. She bent her angular body further and thrust her head into the barrel, under the water, through its glittering surface, into the kind, featureless depth, and held it there. When old Lethe found her, she had fallen forward into the barrel, with her poor, ladylike, black-stocking legs upended and hung apart like a pair of tongs.
A short history of Gothic. The Lady of the House of Love by Angela Carter. Blood. Vampires.
At last the revenants became so troublesome, the peasants abandoned the village, and it fell solely into the possession of subtle and vindictive inhabitants, who manifest their presences by shadows that fall almost imperceptibly awry. Too many shadows, even at midday, shadows that have no source in anything visible. Now all shun the village below the chateau in which the beautiful somnambulist helplessly perpetuates her ancestral crimes. Wearing an antique bridal gown, the beautiful queen of the vampires sits all alone in her dark, high house, under the eyes of the portraits of her demented ancestors, each one of whom, through her, projects a baleful, posthumous existence. She counts out the tarot cards, ceaselessly construing a constellation of possibilities, as if the random fall of the cards on the red plush tablecloth could precipitate her from her chill, shuttered room into a country of perpetual summer and obliterate the perennial sadness of a girl who is both death and the maiden. The castle is mostly given over to ghostly occupants, but she herself has her own suite of drawing room and bedroom. Closely barred shutters and heavy velvet curtains keep out every leak of natural light. This room is never more than faintly illuminated by a heavily shaded lamp on the mantelpiece, and the dark red-figured wallpaper is obscurely, distressingly patterned by the rain that drives in through the neglected roof and leaves behind it random areas of staining, ominous marks like those left on the sheets by dead lovers. But the mistress of all this disintegration notices nothing. She sits in a chair covered in moth-ravaged burgundy velvet at the low round table and distributes the cards. Sometimes her pet lark sings, but more often remains a sullen mound of drab feathers. Sometimes the Countess will wake it for a brief cadenza by strumming the bars of its cage. She likes to hear it announce how it cannot escape. She is so beautiful, she is unnatural. Her beauty is an abnormality, a deformity, for none of her features exhibit any of those touching imperfections that reconcile us to the imperfection of the human condition. Her beauty is a symptom of her disorder, of her soullessness. Her teeth, as fine and white as spikes of spun sugar, are the visible signs of the destiny she wistfully attempts to evade via the arcana. She is the last bud of the poison tree that sprang from the loins of Vlad the Impaler, who picnicked on corpses in the forests of Transylvania. A chignoned priest of the Orthodox faith staked out her wicked father at a Carpathian crossroad before her milk teeth grew. Just as they staked him out, the fatal count cried, "Nosferatu is dead! Long live Nosferatu!" Now she possesses all the haunted forests and mysterious habitations of his vast domain. But the Countess herself is indifferent to her own weird authority, as if she were dreaming it. In her dream, she would like to be human, but she does not know if that is possible. The tarot always shows the same configuration. Always she turns up la papesse, la mort, la tour abolie, wisdom, death, dissolution. On moonless nights, her keeper lets her out into the garden. All the roses her dead mother planted have grown up into a huge, spiked wall that incarcerates her in the castle of her inheritance. When the back door opens, the Countess will sniff the air and howl. She drops now on all fours, crouching, quivering. She catches the scent of her prey. The eyes of this nocturnal creature enlarge and glow. All claws and teeth, she strikes, she gorges, but nothing can console her for the ghastliness of her condition, nothing. An old mute looks after her to make sure she never sees the sun, that all day she stays in her coffin to keep mirrors and all reflective surfaces away from her. In short, to perform all the functions of the servants of vampires. Everything about this beautiful and ghastly lady is as it should be, queen of night, queen of terror, except her horrible reluctance for the role. Nevertheless, if an unwise adventurer pauses in the square of the deserted village to refresh himself at the fountain, a crone in a black dress and white apron presently emerges from a house. She will invite you with smiles and gestures. You will follow her. The Countess wants fresh meat. When she was a little girl, she contented herself entirely with baby rabbits, with voles and field mice that palpitated for a bare moment between her embroideress's fingers. But now she is a woman. She must have men. If you stop too long beside the giggling fountain, you will be led by the hand to the Countess's larder. When the sun drops behind the mountain, she yawns and stirs and puts on the only dress she has, her mother's wedding dress, to sit and read her cards until she grows hungry. Afterwards, her governess will tidy the remains into a neat pile and wrap it in its own discarded clothes. This mortal parcel she then discreetly buries in the garden. One hot, ripe summer, in the pubescent years of the last century, a young officer in the British Army, blonde, blue-eyed, decided to spend the remainder of his furlough exploring the little-known uplands of Romania. When he quixotically decided to travel the rutted cart tracks by bicycle, he saw all the humour of it. On 2 wheels in the land of the vampires. So, laughing, he sets out on his adventure. He has the special quality of virginity, most and least ambiguous of states. Ignorance, yet at the same time power in potentia, and furthermore unknowingness, which is not the same as ignorance. He is more than he knows, and has about him, besides, the special glamour of that generation for whom history has already prepared a special, exemplary fate in the trenches of France. This being, rooted in change and time, is about to collide with the timeless Gothic eternity of the vampires, whose cards always fall in the same pattern. Although so young, he is also rational. He has chosen the most rational mode of transport in the world. To ride a bicycle is in itself some protection against superstitious fears, since the bicycle is the product of pure reason applied to motion, geometry at the service of man. A single kiss woke up the sleeping beauty in the wood. The waxen fingers of the Countess turn up the card called Les Amoureux. Never before has the Countess cast herself a fate involving love. She shakes, she trembles. The lovely cartomancer has this time, the first time, dealt herself a hand of love and death. At the mauvish beginnings of evening, the English monsieur toils up the hill to the village he glimpsed from a great way off. He hopes to find a friendly inn to rest the night. He's hot, hungry, thirsty, weary, dusty. At first, such disappointment to discover the roofs of all the cottages caved in and tall weeds thrusting through the piles of fallen tiles. But the adventure of it all, and the fountain where the village women used to wash their clothes, still gushing out bright, clear water. These considerations soon overcame his disappointment, even assuaged the faint unease he'd felt. When he raised his dripping, gratified head from the lion's mouth, he saw, silently arrived beside him in the square, an old woman who smiled eagerly at him. She bobbed a curtsy at the young man and beckoned him to follow her. When he hesitated, she pointed towards the great bulk of the mansion above them, rubbed her stomach, pointed to her mouth, rubbed her stomach again, clearly miming an invitation to supper. Then she beckoned him again, this time turning determinedly upon her heel as though she would brook no opposition. A great intoxicated surge of the heavy scent of red roses blew into his face as soon as they left the village, inducing a sensuous vertigo. Too many roses bloomed on enormous thickets that lined the path, their huge congregations of plush petals somehow obscene in their excess, their walled, tightly budded cores outrageous in their implications. The mansion emerged grudgingly out of this jungle. He could almost have regretted accepting the crone's unspoken invitation, but now, standing before the door of time-eroded oak, he knew it was too late to turn back, and brusquely reminded himself he was no child now to be frightened of his own fancies. The old lady unlocked the door, which swung back on melodramatically creaking hinges, and fussily took charge of his bicycle, in spite of his protests. He felt a certain involuntary sinking of the heart to see his beautiful two-wheeled symbol of rationality vanish into the dark entrails of the mansion. But, in for a penny, in for a pound, in his youth and strength and blonde beauty, in the invisible, even unacknowledged pentacle of his virginity, the young man stepped over the threshold of Nosferatu's castle and did not shiver in the blast of cold air that emanated from the lightless, cavernous interior. The crone took him to a little chamber where there was a black oak table spread with a clean white cloth, and this cloth was carefully laid with heavy silverware, a little tarnished, as if someone with foul breath had breathed on it, but laid with one place only. Curiouser and curiouser, invited to the castle for dinner, now he must dine alone. The crone disappeared, but soon returned bearing a steaming platter of the local spiced meat stew with dumplings and a shank of black bread. When he'd put away a second plateful, the old woman came and gestured he should leave the table and follow her once again. She made a pantomime of drinking. He deduced he was now invited to take after-dinner coffee in another room with some more elevated member of the household who had not wished to dine with him, but all the same wanted to make his acquaintance. He was surprised to find how ruinous the interior of the house was. Cobwebs, worm-eaten beans, crumbling plaster. But the mute crone resolutely wound him on the reel of her lantern down endless corridors. At last she paused, and behind the door where they'd halted he heard a faint metallic twang, as of perhaps a chord struck on a harpsichord, and then wonderfully the liquid cascade of the song of a lark, bringing to him in the heart, had he but known it, of Juliet's tomb, all the freshness of morning. The crone rapped with her knuckles on the panels. The most seductively caressing voice he had ever heard in his life softly called out in heavily accented French, the adopted language of the Romanian aristocracy. Entrez. First of all, he saw only a shape imbued with a faint luminosity, since it caught and reflected in its yellowed surfaces what little light there was in the ill-lit room. This shape resolved itself into that of all things, a hoop-skirted dress of white satin, a dress 50 or 60 years out of fashion, but once obviously intended for a wedding. So that it was little by little, as his eyes grew accustomed to the half-dark, that he saw how beautiful and how very young the bedizened scarecrow was, and he thought of a child dressing up in her mother's clothes, perhaps a child putting on the clothes of a dead mother in order to bring her, however briefly, to life again. The Countess stood behind a low table. Her huge dark eyes almost broke his heart with their waif-like lost look, yet he was disturbed, almost repelled, by her extraordinarily fleshy mouth, a mouth with wide, full, prominent lips of a vibrant purplish crimson, a morbid mouth, even, but he put the thought away from him immediately, a whore's mouth. She was the chatelaine of all this decay. With many tender precautions, the crone now raised the light she held to show his hostess her guest's face. At that, the Countess let out a faint, mewing cry and made a blind, appalled gesture with her hands as if pushing him away, so that she knocked against the table and a butterfly dazzle of painted cards fell to the floor. A bewildering reception. Tusking under her breath, the crone busily poked about on the table until she found an enormous pair of dark green glasses, such as blind beggars wear, and perched them on the Countess's nose. He went forward to pick up her cards for her, shuffled them carelessly together, for they meant nothing to him, though they seemed strange playthings for a young girl. What a grisly picture of a capering skeleton! He covered it up with a happier one, of two young lovers smiling at one another, and put her toys back into a hand, so slender you could almost see the frail net of bone beneath the translucent skin. At his touch she seemed to revive a little and almost smiled, raising herself upright. "Coffee," she said. "You must have coffee." The crone found him a chair and, tittering noiselessly, departed, leaving the room a little darker. While the young lady attended to the coffee-making, he had time to contemplate with some distaste a series of family portraits which decorated the stained and peeling walls. These livid faces all seemed contorted with a febrile madness, and the blubber lips, the huge demented eyes that all had in common, bore a disquieting resemblance to those of the hapless victim of inbreeding, now patiently filtering her fragrant brew, even if some rare grace has so finely transformed those features when it came to her case. Soon she held out to him a tiny cup of rose-painted china. "Welcome," she said in her voice with the rushing sonorities of the ocean in it. "Welcome to my chateau. I rarely receive visitors, and that's a misfortune, since nothing animates me half as much as the presence of a stranger. This place is so lonely, now the village is deserted, and my one companion, alas, she cannot speak. Often I am so silent that I think I too will soon forget how to do so, and nobody here will ever talk any more." Her voice, issuing from those red lips like the obese roses in her garden, her voice is curiously disembodied. She is like a doll, he thought, a ventriloquist's doll, or more, like a great ingenious piece of clockwork. For she seemed inadequately powered by some slow energy of which she was not in control. This idea that she might be an automaton never quite deserted him. Indeed, it deeply moved his heart. "And the light, I must apologize for the lack of light, a hereditary affliction of the eyes." Her blind spectacles gave him his handsome face back to himself twice over. "Vous serez ma proie." "You will be my prey." "You have such a fine throat, monsieur, like a column of marble. When you came through the door retaining about you all the golden light of the summer's day, of which I know nothing, the card called Les Amoureux had just emerged from the tumbling chaos of imagery before me. It seemed to me you had stepped off the card into my darkness, and for a moment I thought perhaps you might irradiate it."
The bridegroom is come. He will go into the chamber which has been prepared for him. And could love free me from the shadows? Can a bird sing only the song it knows, or can it learn a new song? See how I'm ready for you. I've always been ready for you. I've been waiting for you in my wedding dress. Why have you delayed so long? It will all be over very quickly. You will feel no pain, my darling.
One kiss, however, and only one, woke up the sleeping beauty in the wood. Nervously, to conceal her inner voices, she keeps up a front of inconsequential chatter in French. However hard she tries to think of any other, she only knows of one kind of consummation. A fundamental disbelief in what he sees before him sustains him, even in the boudoir of Countess Nosferatu herself. He would have said, perhaps, that there are some things which, even if they are true, we should not believe possible. Not so much that he does not believe in her, he can see her, she is real. But since he himself is immune to shadow, due to his virginity, he does not yet know what there is to be afraid of, and due to his heroism, which makes him like the sun, he sees before him first and foremost an inbred, highly strung girl-child, fatherless, motherless, kept in the dark too long and pale as a plant that never sees the light, half blinded by some hereditary condition of the eyes. And though he feels unease, he cannot feel terror. So he is like the boy in the fairy tale who does not know how to shudder. This lack of imagination gives his heroism to the hero. He will learn to shudder in the trenches, but this girl cannot make him shudder. Now it is dark. The coffee is all drunk. Her chatter comes trickling and diminishing to a stop. Owls shriek. The impedimenta of her condition squeak and gibber all around us. Now you are at the place of annihilation. Now you are at the place of annihilation.
Suivez-moi. Je vous attendais. Vous serez ma proie.
Dinner time, clang the portraits on the walls. A ghastly hunger gnaws her entrails. The handsome bicyclist, scarcely believing his luck, will follow her into her bedroom. She will assure him in the very voice of temptation, "My clothes have but to fall, and you will see before you a succession of mysteries." In her low, sweet voice, she will croon the lullaby of the house of Nosferatu.
Embraces, kisses, your golden head of the sun, even if I've only seen the picture of the sun on the tarot card, your golden head of the lover whom I dreamed would one day free me, this head will fall back, its eyes roll upwards in a spasm you will mistake for that of love and not of death. The bridegroom bleeds on my inverted marriage bed.
Stark and dead, poor bicyclist. He has paid the price of a night with the Countess, and some think it too high a fee, while some do not. Tomorrow her keeper will bury his bones under her roses. The food her roses feed on gives them their rich colour, their swooning odour that breathes lasciviously of forbidden pleasures.
Suivez-moi.
Suivez-moi. The handsome bicyclist, fearful for his hostess's health, her sanity, gingerly follows her hysterical imperiousness into the other room. What a macabre bedroom! His colonel, an old goat with jaded appetites, had given him the visiting card of a brothel in Paris, where, the satyr assured him, 10 louis would buy just such a lugubrious bedroom, with a naked girl upon a coffin. He had good-naturedly refused the old man's offer of such an initiation. How can he now take criminal advantage of this disordered girl, with eyes that deny all the erotic promises of her body, with their terror, their sadness, their dreadful balked tenderness? So delicate and damned, poor thing, quite damned. Yet I do believe she scarcely knows what she is doing. She is shaking as if her limbs were not efficiently joined together, as if she might shake into pieces. She raises her hands to unfasten the neck of her dress. She can't take off her mother's wedding dress unless she takes off her dark glasses. She has fumbled the ritual. It is no longer inexorable. When she takes off the dark glasses, they slip from her fingers and smash to pieces on the tiled floor. There is no room in her drama for improvisation, and this unexpected, mundane noise of breaking glass breaks the wicked spell in the room entirely. When she kneels to try to gather the fragments of glass together, a sharp sliver pierces deeply into the pad of her thumb. She cries out, sharp, real. She has never seen her own blood before, not her own blood. It exercises upon her an odd fascination. Into this vile and murderous room, the handsome bicyclist brings the innocent remedies of the nursery. In himself, by his presence, he is an exorcism. He gently takes her hand away from her and dabs the blood with his own handkerchief, but still it spurts out. And so he puts his mouth to the wound. He will kiss it better for her, as her mother, had she lived, would have done. Her painted ancestors turn away their eyes and grind their fangs.
How can she bear the pain of becoming human?
The end of exile is the end of being. He was awakened by lark song. The shutters, the curtains, even the long-sealed windows of the horrid bedroom were all opened up, and light and air streamed in. She must have set her pet lark free, because it perched on the edge of the silly coffin to sing him its ecstatic morning song. His bones were stiff and aching. He'd slept on the floor with his bundled-up jacket for a pillow after he'd put her to bed. But now there was no trace of her to be seen, except lightly tossed across the crumpled black satin bed cover, a lace negligée, lightly soiled with blood, as it might be from a woman's menses, and a rose that must have come from the fierce bushes nodding through the window. He padded into the boudoir, his mind busy with plans. We shall take her to Zurich to a clinic. She will be treated for nervous hysteria. Then to an eye specialist for her photophobia, and to a dentist to put her teeth into better shape. Any competent manicurist will deal with her claws. We shall turn her into the lovely girl she is. I shall cure her of all these nightmares. The heavy curtains are pulled back to let in brilliant fusillades of early morning light. In the desolation of the boudoir, she sits at her round table in her white dress, with the cards laid out before her. She has dropped off to sleep over the cards of destiny that are so fingered, so soiled, so worn by constant shuffling, that you can no longer make the image out on any single one of them. She is not sleeping. In death, she looked far older, less beautiful, and so, for the first time, fully human.
I will vanish in the morning light. I was only an invention of darkness, and I leave you as a souvenir the dark-fanged rose I plucked, like a flower laid on a grave. On a grave. My keeper will attend to everything.
And now the crone materialized, weeping, and roughly gestured him to be gone. After a search in some foul-smelling outhouses, he discovered his bicycle and, abandoning his holiday, rode directly to Bucharest, where, at the post restaurant, he found a telegram summoning him to rejoin his regiment at once. Much later, when he changed back into uniform in his quarters, he discovered he still had the Countess's rose. He must have tucked it into the breast pocket of his cycling jacket after he had found her body. Curiously enough, although he had brought it so far away from Romania, the flower did not seem to be quite dead, and on impulse, because the girl had been so lovely and her death so unexpected and pathetic, he decided to try and resurrect her rose. He filled his toothglass with water from the carafe on his locker and popped the rose into it, so that its withered head floated on the surface. When he returned from the mess that evening, the heavy fragrance of Count Nosferatu's roses drifted down the stone corridor to greet him, and his Spartan quarters brimmed with the reeling odour of a glowing, monstrous flower whose petals had regained all their former bloom, their corrupt, brilliant, baleful splendour. Next day, his regiment embarked for France.
A short history of Gothic. Those Who Seek Forgiveness by Laurell K Hamilton.
Betrayal. Zombies.
Death is a very serious matter, Mrs. Fisk. People who go through it are never the same. The woman leaned forward, cradling her face in her hands. Her slim shoulders shook quietly for a few minutes. I passed another box of tissues her way. She groped for them blindly and then looked up. I know you can't bring him back, exactly. She wiped 2 tears, which escaped and rolled down flawless cheekbones. The purse she clutched so tightly was reptile, at least $200. Her accessories, lapel pin, high heels, hat and gloves, were all black as her purse. Her suit was gray. Neither color suited her, but they emphasized her pale skin and hollow eyes. She was the sort of woman that made me feel too short, too dark, and gave me the strange desire to lose 10 more pounds. If she hadn't been so genuinely grief-stricken, I could have disliked her. I have to talk to Arthur. That's my husband. Was my husband. She took a deep breath and tried again. Arthur died suddenly, a massive coronary. She blew delicately into a tissue. His family did have a history of heart disease, but he always took such good care of himself. She finished with a watery hiccup. I want to say goodbye to him, Miss Blake. I smiled reassuringly. We all have things left unsaid when death comes suddenly, but it isn't always best to raise the dead and say it. Her blue eyes stared intently through a film of tears. I was going to discourage her, as I discourage every one of my clients, but this one would do it. There was a certain set to the eyes that said serious. There are certain limitations to the process. My boss didn't allow us to show slides or pictures or give graphic descriptions, but we were supposed to tell the truth. One good picture of a decaying zombie would have sent most of my clients screaming. Limitations? Yes, we can bring him back. You came to us promptly. That helps. He's been buried only 3 days, but as a zombie, your husband will only have limited use of his body and mind. And as the days go by, that will grow worse, not better. She stood up very straight, tears drying on her face. I was hoping you could bring him back as a vampire. I kept my face carefully blank. Vampires are illegal, Mrs. Fisk. A friend told me that you could get that done here. She finished in a rush, searching my face. I smiled, my best professional smile. We do not do vampires. And even if we did, you can't make an ordinary corpse into a vampire. Ordinary? Very few people who came to us had even a remote idea of how rare vampires were or why. The deceased would have to have been bitten by a werewolf, vampire, or other supernatural creature while alive. Being buried in unconsecrated ground would help. Your husband, Arthur, was never bitten by a vampire while alive, was he? No, she half laughed. He was bitten by my Yorkshire Terrier once. I smiled, encouraging her turn of spirits. That won't quite do it. Your husband can come back as a zombie or not at all. I'll take it, she said quietly, all serious and very still. I will warn you that most families find it advisable to lay the zombie to rest after a time. Why? Why? I saw the happy family embracing their lost loved one. I saw the family sick, horrified, bringing the decaying corpse to be put down, the smiling relative reduced to a shambling horror. What exactly do you want Arthur to do when he arises? She looked down and shredded another tissue. I want to say goodbye to him. Yes, Mrs. Fisk, but what do you want him to do? She was silent for several minutes. I decided to prompt her. For instance, a woman came in wanting her husband raised so he could take out life insurance. I told her most insurance companies won't insure the walking dead. She grinned at that. And that is what Arthur will come back as. The walking dead. Her smile faltered, and tears came again. I want Arthur to forgive me. She hid her face in her hands and sobbed. I had an affair for several months. He found out, had a heart attack, and died. She seemed to gain strength from the words, and the tears slowed. You see, I have to talk to him one last time. I have to tell him I love him, only him. I want Arthur to forgive me. Can he do that? As a zombie? I've found that the dead are very forgiving of the living when they die of natural causes. Your husband will have ample brain power to speak. He will be himself at first. As the days progress, he will lose memory. He will begin to decay, first mentally, then physically. The relatives didn't really believe that a fresh zombie wasn't alive. Knowing intellectually that someone smiling and talking as the walking dead is one thing, emotionally, it is very different. But they believed as time passed and as he or she began to look like a walking corpse. It's temporary then? Not exactly. I came from behind my desk and sat next to her. He could stay a zombie possibly forever, but his physical and mental state would deteriorate until he was not much better than an automaton in tattered flesh. Tattered flesh? She whispered. I touched her hand. I know it's a hard choice, but that is the reality. She gripped my hand and smiled. Thank you for telling me the truth. I still want to bring Arthur back, even if it's just long enough to say a few words. So she was going to do it, as I had known she would. So you don't want him for weeks or days, only long enough to talk? I think so. I don't mean to rush you, Mrs. Fisk, but I need to know before we set up an appointment. You see, it takes more time and energy to raise and then lay to rest, one right after another. If she laid and raised quickly enough, Mrs. Fisk might be able to remember Arthur at his best. Oh, of course. If possible, I would like to talk for several hours. Then it's best if you take him home for at least the evening. We can schedule putting him back for tomorrow night. That sounds good. She took a deep breath. I knew what she was going to say. She looked so brave and resolute. I want to be there when you bring him back. Your presence is required, Mrs. Fisk. You see, a zombie has no real will of its own. Your husband should be able to think on his own at first, but as time wears on, the zombie finds it very difficult to decide things. The person or persons who raised it will have control over it. You and I? Yes. She paled even more, her grip tightening. Mrs. Fisk? I got her a glass of water. Sip it slowly. When she seemed better, I asked, Are you sure you're up to this tonight? Is there anything I need to bring? A suit of your husband's clothes would be nice. Maybe a favorite object, hat, trophy, to help him orient himself. The rest I'll supply. I hesitated because some of the color had crept into her face, but she needed to be prepared. There will be blood at the ceremony. Blood? Her voice was a breathy whisper. Chicken. I'll bring it. There will also be some ointment to spread over our faces and hands. It glows faintly and smells fairly strange, but not unpleasant. Her next question would be the usual. What do we do with the blood? I gave the usual answer. We sprinkle some on the grave and some on us." She swallowed very carefully, looking slightly gray. "You can back out now, but not later. Once you've paid your deposit, it can't be refunded. And once the ceremony begins, to break the circle is very dangerous." She looked down, thinking. I liked that. Most who agreed right away were afraid later. The brave ones took time to answer. "Yes." She sounded very convinced. "To make peace with Arthur, I can do it." "Good for you. How is tonight?" "About midnight?" she added hopefully. I smiled. Everyone thought midnight was the perfect time for raising the dead. All that was required was darkness. Some people did put a great deal of stock in certain phases of the moon, but I had never found it necessary. "No. How about 9 o'clock? 9? If that will be all right. I have 2 other appointments tonight, and 9 was left open." She smiled. "That will be fine." Her hand shook as she signed the check for half the fee, the other half to be delivered after the raising. We shook hands, and she said, "Call me Carla. I'm Anita. I'll see you tonight at 9 at Wellington Cemetery," I continued for her, between 2 large trees and across from the only hill. "Yes, thank you." She flashed a watery smile and was gone. I leaned back in my chair and soaked up the silence. 3 animations a night was my limit. Tonight they were all routine, or almost. I was bringing back my first research scientist. His 3 colleagues couldn't figure out his notes, and their deadline, or rather grant, was running close. So dear Dr. Richard Norris was coming back from the dead to help them out. They were scheduled for midnight. At 3 this next morning, I would meet the widowed Mrs. Steiner. She wanted her husband to clear up some nasty details with his will. Being an animator meant very little nightlife. No pun intended. Afternoons were spent interviewing clients, and evenings raising the dead. Though we few were very popular at a certain kind of party, the sort where the host likes to brag about how many celebrities he knows, or worse yet, the kind who simply want to stare. I don't like being on display and refuse to go to parties unless forced. Our boss likes to keep us in the public eye to dispel rumors that we are witches or hobgoblins. It's pretty pitiful at parties. All the animators huddled, talking shop like a bunch of doctors. But doctors don't get called witch, monster, zombie queen. Very few people remember to call us animators. For most, we are a dark joke. "This is Anita. She makes zombies and I don't mean the drink." Then there would be laughter all around, and I would smile politely and know I'd be going home early. Tonight, there was no party to worry over, just work. Work was power, magic, a strange dark impulse to raise more than what you were paid for. We were different, drawn to the night, unafraid of death in its many forms, because we had a sympathy for it. Tonight, I would raise the dead. Wellington Cemetery was new. All the tombstones were nearly the same size, square, rectangle, and set off into the night near perfect rows. Young trees and perfectly clipped evergreen shrubs lined the gravel driveway. The moon rose strong and high, bathing the scene clearly, if mysteriously, in silver and black. A handful of huge trees dotted the grounds. They looked out of place among all this newness. As Carla had said, only 2 of them grew close together. As my car crunched over gravel, I could see someone dressed in white. A flare of orange was a match, and the reddish pinpoint of a cigarette sprang to life. I stopped the car. Carla had beaten me here. Very unusual. Most clients want to spend as little time as possible near the grave after dark. I walked over to her before unloading equipment. There was a litter of burnt-out cigarettes, like stubby white bugs about her feet. She must have been here in the dark for hours waiting to raise a zombie. She either was punishing herself or enjoyed the idea. There was no way of knowing which. Her dress, shoes, even hose were white. She was leaning against one of the trees, and its black trunk emphasized her whiteness. She only turned her head as I came up to her. Her eyes looked silver gray in the light. I couldn't decipher the look on her face. It wasn't grief. "It's a beautiful night, isn't it?" I agreed that it was. "Carla, are you all right?" She stared at me, terribly calm. "I'm feeling much better than I did this afternoon." "I'm very glad to hear that. Did you remember to bring his clothes and a memento?" She motioned to a dark bundle by the tree. "Good. I'll unload the car." She didn't offer to help, which was not unusual. Most of the time, it was fear that prevented it. I realized my Omega was the only car in sight. I called softly, but sound carries on summer nights. "How did you get here? I don't see a car." "I hired a cab. It's waiting at the gate." A cab? I would love to have seen the driver's face when he dropped her off at the cemetery gates. The 3 black chickens clucked from their cage in the back seat. They didn't have to be black, but it was the only color I could get for tonight. I was beginning to think our poultry supplier had a sense of humor. Arthur Fisk was only recently dead, so from the box in the trunk, I took only a jar of homemade ointment and a machete. The ointment was pale off-white with flecks of greenish light in it. The glowing flecks were graveyard mold. You wouldn't find it in this cemetery. It only grew in graveyards that had stood for at least 100 years. The ointment also contained the obligatory spider webs and other noisome things, plus herbs and spices to hide the smell and aid the magic, if it was magic. I smeared the tombstone with it and called Carla over. "It's your turn now, Carla." She stubbed out her cigarette and came to stand before me. I smeared her face and hands and told her, "You stand just behind the tombstone throughout the raising." She took her place without a word while I placed ointment on myself. The pine scent of rosemary for memory, cinnamon and cloves for preservation, sage for wisdom, and lemon thyme to bind it all together seemed to soak through the skin itself. I picked the largest chicken and tucked it under my arm. There was an art to beheading a chicken with only 2 hands. I stood at the foot of the grave to kill the chicken. Its first artery blood splashed onto the grave. It splattered over the fading chrysanthemums, roses, and carnations. A spire of white gladioli turned dark. I walked a circle, sprinkling blood as I went, tracing a circle of steel with a bloody machete. Carla shut her eyes as the blood rained upon her. I smeared blood on myself and placed the still twitching body upon the flower mound. Then I stood once again at the foot of the grave. We were cut off now, inside the blood circle, alone with the night and our thoughts. Carla's eyes flashed white at me as I began the chant. "Hear me, Arthur Fisk. I call you from the grave. By blood, magic, and steel, I call you. Arise, Arthur. Come to us. Come to me, Arthur Fisk." Carla joined me as she was supposed to. "Come to us, Arthur. Come to us, Arthur. Arthur, arise." The flowers shuddered. The mound heaved upward, and the chicken slid to the side. A hand clawed free, ghostly pale. A second hand, and Carla's voice failed her. She began moving round the gravestone to kneel to the left of the heaving mound. There was such wonder, even awe in her face, as I called Arthur Fisk from the grave. The arms were free. The top of a dark-haired head was in sight, but the top was almost all there was. The mortician had done his best, but Arthur's had been a closed casket funeral. The right side of his face was gone, blasted away. The left eye rolled wildly in the bare socket. I could see the tongue moving between the broken teeth. Arthur Fisk struggled from the grave. I tried to remain calm. It could be a mistake. Is that Arthur? Her hoarse whisper came to me. Yes. That is not a heart attack. No. Her voice was calm now, incredibly normal. No, I shot him at close range. You killed him? And had me bring him back? Arthur was having some trouble freeing his legs, and I ran to Carla. I tried to help her to her feet, but she wouldn't move. Get up! Get up, damn it! He'll kill you! Her next words were very quiet. If that's what he wants. God help me, a suicide! I forced her to look at me instead of the thing in the grave. Carla, a murdered zombie always kills his murderer first. Always. No forgiveness. That is a rule. I can't control him until after he has killed you. You have to run. Now. She saw me, understood, I think, but said, This is the only way to be free of guilt. If he forgives me, I'll be free. You'll be dead. Arthur freed himself and was sitting on the crushed, earth-strewn flowers. It would take him a little while to organize, but not too long. Carla, he will kill you. There will be no forgiveness. Her eyes had wandered back to the zombie, and I slapped her twice, very hard. Carla, you will die out here. And for what? Arthur is dead. Really dead. You don't want to die. Arthur slid off the flowers and stood uncertainly. His eye rolling around in its socket finally spotted us. Though we didn't have much to show expression with, I could see joy on his face. There was a twitch of a smile as he shambled towards us, and I began dragging her away. She didn't fight me, but she was a dead, awkward weight. I let her sink back to the ground. I looked at the clumsy but determined zombie and decided to try. I stood in front of him, blocking him from Carla. I called upon whatever power I possessed and talked to him. Arthur Fisk, hear me. Listen only to me. He stopped moving and stared down at me. It was working. Against all the rules, it was working. It was Carla who spoiled it, her voice saying, Arthur! Arthur, forgive me! He was distracted and tried to move toward her voice. I stopped him with a hand on his chest. Arthur, I command you, do not move. I who raised you command you. She called one more time. That was all he needed. He flung me away absent-mindedly. My head hit the tombstone. It wasn't much of a blow, no blood like on television, but it took everything out of me for a minute. Arthur reached down for her, slowly. His face twitched, and his tongue made small sounds that might have been, Carla. The clumsy hand stroked her hair. He half fell, half knelt by her. She drew back at that, afraid. I started crawling over the flowers toward them. She was not going to commit suicide with my help. The hand stroked her face, and she backed away just a few inches. The thing crawled after her. She backpedaled faster, but he came on surprisingly quick. He pinned her under his body, and she started screaming. I half crawled, half fell across the zombie's back. The hands crept up her body, touching her shoulders. Her eyes rolled back to me. Help me. I tried. I tugged at him, trying to pull him off her. Zombies do not have supernatural strength, no matter what the media would like you to think, but Arthur had been a large, muscular man. If he could have felt pain, I might have pulled him off, but there was no real way to distract him. Anita, please. The hand settled on her neck and squeezed. I found the machete where it had dropped to the ground. It was sharp and did damage, but he couldn't feel it. Even decapitated, he would keep coming. His hands were the problem. I knelt and sighted at his lower arm. I didn't dare try it any closer to her face. The blade flashed silver. I brought it down with all the strength in my back and arms, but it took 5 blows to break the bone. The separated hand kept squeezing as if it were still attached. I threw the machete down and began prying one finger at a time from her neck. It was time-consuming. Carla stopped struggling. The strong hands squeezed until there was a cracking sound. Not a sharp pencil break, like a leg or an arm, but a crackling as the bones crushed together. Arthur seemed satisfied. He stood up from the body. All expression left him. He was empty, waiting for a command. I tried to tell him to stay, but my voice wouldn't come. His eye followed me as I stumbled to the car. I came back with a handful of salt. In the other hand, I scooped the fresh grave dirt. Arthur watched me without expression. I stood at the outer edge of the circle. I give you back to the earth from which you came. I threw the dirt upon him. He turned to face me. With salt, I bind you to your grave. The salt sounded like sleet on his suit. I made the sign of a cross with the machete. With steel, I give you back. I realized that I had begun the ceremony without getting another chicken. I bent and retrieved the dead one and slit it open. With flesh and blood, I command you, Arthur. Return to your grave and walk no more. He laid down upon the grave. It was as if he had lain in quicksand. It just swallowed him up. With a last shifting of flowers, the grave was as before. Almost. I threw the gutted chicken to the ground and knelt beside the woman's body. Her neck flopped at an angle, just slightly wrong. I got up and shut the trunk of my car. Would I dream about Carla tonight? Would I try to save her again and again? I hoped not. I looked at the body by the grave, the whiteness of it stained now with dirt. So much for the other half of my fee. I got in the car, smearing blood over the steering wheel and key. There were phone calls to make, to my boss, to the police, and to cancel the rest of my appointments. I would be raising no more dead tonight. There was a taxi to send away. I wondered how much the meter had run up. My thoughts ran in dull, frightened circles. I began to shake, hands trembling. Tears came hot and violent. I sobbed and screamed in the privacy of my car. When I could breathe, without choking, and my hand was steady, I put the car in gear. I would definitely be seeing Carla tonight, and Arthur. What's one more nightmare? I left Carla there alone, with Arthur's forgiveness, one leg lost in the flowers of his grave.